The year is 1945. The war in Europe is over. The celebrations haven't even ended. But somewhere in the United States, behind closed factory gates, a machine is sitting in silence. A machine that arrived too late for the war it was built to win. A machine that could have changed everything and changed nothing. This is the T-34, not the Soviet legend you've heard about 1,000 times, the American one. 42 tons of ambition, a gun that could crack any armor on the planet, and a story so full of bad timing, bad luck, and bad decisions that you almost feel sorry for a tank. Almost. How did America build one of the most powerful heavy tanks of World War II and manage to miss the entire war with it? Stay with me. To understand the T-34, you need to go back to 1942. America had just entered the war, and the situation was not pretty. The Sherman was the backbone of American armor, reliable, fast, easy to produce, and increasingly outmatched by German heavy tanks. When the Tiger appeared on the battlefield, Sherman crews learned a brutal lesson. Their 75mm gun often couldn't penetrate German frontal armor at combat distances. Meanwhile, the Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman from ranges the Americans couldn't even fight back from. Reports from North Africa and Italy came back with the same message. The Sherman was brave, the Sherman was everywhere, and the Sherman was burning. The army needed something bigger, something that could go toe-to-toe with a Tiger and walk away. Something with a gun that didn't ask politely, it demanded. The answer they reached for was the T-29 and T-30 heavy tank program. And from that program, pushing the boundaries even further, came the T-34. Armed with a 120mm anti-aircraft gun converted for tank use. A weapon so powerful it was essentially overkill against anything Germany had fielded, or was planning to field. The man at the center of this story wasn't a single genius working alone. The T-34 was a product of a system, the United States Army Ordnance Department, with all the bureaucracy, competing priorities, and institutional stubbornness that implies. But the engineers who worked on it were genuinely talented. They took the long 120mm T-53 gun, originally designed to shoot down high-altitude aircraft, and asked a simple, brutal question. What happens when we point this at a tank? The answer was devastation. The T-34's gun could punch through over 250mm of armor at combat ranges. To put that in perspective, the Tiger II, Germany's heaviest production tank, had about 180mm of frontal armor at its thickest. The T-34 didn't just threaten the Tiger II, it made it irrelevant. But building a tank around a gun this size was its own engineering challenge. The gun was enormous. The turret had to be enormous to fit it, and the hull had to be strong enough to carry everything without shaking itself apart when the gun fired. The recoil forces involved were staggering. This wasn't a tank gun in the traditional sense. This was an artillery piece that someone had decided to put on tracks and point at other tanks. Early testing revealed the expected problems. The gun's recoil system needed redesigning. The turret traverse mechanism struggled with the weight. The vehicle itself, riding on a modified version of the Pershing suspension, needed refinement to handle the extra mass. And through all of it, the clock was ticking. Because while the engineers were solving problems, the war was ending. Let's talk about what the T-34 actually was when it reached its final form. Because even as an unfinished chapter, it was genuinely remarkable. 42 tons. For comparison, the Sherman weighed around 30 to 33 tons, depending on the variant. The T-34 was significantly heavier, but used a more powerful engine to compensate, around 770 horsepower from a Ford GAC V12. Top speed was approximately 35 kilometers per hour. Not fast, but not a dead weight either. The armor was serious without being extraordinary, around 102 millimeters on the front hull, similar on the turret front. Enough to stop most German anti-tank weapons at medium range, though not immune to the 88mm guns that were Germany's standard heavy weapon by the end of the war. But the gun. The gun is the whole story. The 120mm T-53 fired a shell that weighed around 23 kilograms. The muzzle velocity was high enough that at 1,000 meters, It was punching through armor that simply didn't exist on any tank the Germans had built or were planning to build. It was future-proofed in the most literal sense, designed not just for today's threat, but for whatever might appear in the next decade. The crew was 6 men: commander, gunner, loader, actually 2 loaders given the shell size, driver and assistant driver. That 2-loader requirement tells you everything about the physical reality of operating this weapon. One person physically could not handle these shells fast enough. They were heavy, awkward, and demanding even in ideal conditions. Under fire, in a moving tank, after the 5th or 6th shot, exhausting doesn't begin to cover it. The fire control was advanced for its era. The Americans invested heavily in optics and fire control systems throughout the war, and the T-34 benefited from that institutional knowledge. The gun was accurate at ranges where other tanks were still trying to figure out if they were looking at a target or a shadow. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Japan surrendered in August 1945. The T-34 was still in development. That sentence contains the entire tragedy of this machine. When the war ended, the military logic that had created the T-34 evaporated almost overnight. The army didn't need a tank destroyer for Tigers that no longer existed. It didn't need to break through German defensive lines that had already collapsed. The entire strategic context that justified a 42-ton, 6-man, oversized gun machine simply ceased to exist. The production orders were cancelled. The program was wound down. The handful of prototypes that had been completed were sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground for evaluation and testing, useful for gathering data, for refining future designs, for understanding what worked and what didn't. But they would never see a battlefield. Only a few T-34s were ever completed. They sit today in various states of preservation, one at Aberdeen, others in storage or display. Machines frozen in the moment of their irrelevance, built for a war that ended without them, designed to fight an enemy that had already surrendered. So how does the T-34 compare to what it was built to fight, and what came after? Against the Tiger II, Germany's heaviest production tank, the T-34 wins decisively on firepower. The 120mm gun would have gone through the Tiger II's frontal armor at ranges where the German gun might have struggled to return the favor. The T-34 is heavier but comparably mobile. On paper, it's a one-sided contest. Against the Soviet IS-2, the heavy tank that actually did most of the fighting on the Eastern Front, it's closer. The IS-2's 122mm gun was devastating but slower to reload and less accurate at long range. The T-34's gun was more precise, faster firing with its 2-loader system, and arguably more effective at extended ranges. Different philosophies. The Soviets built for devastating power at any cost. The Americans built for precision and rate of fire. Against the British Conqueror, which came years later and finally gave Britain its own 120mm heavy tank, the T-34 essentially anticipated the same solution by nearly a decade. Heavier armor on the Conqueror, similar gun concept, similar purpose. The British just actually put theirs into service. And against modern tanks, the gun concept, a 120mm smoothbore, is still the standard for NATO's main battle tanks today. The Leopard 2, the Abrams, the Challenger 2's replacement. The caliber the Americans were bolting onto a prototype in 1944 is what the world's best tanks still carry 80 years later. The T-34 wasn't wrong, it was just early. What do you say about a tank that won every test and missed every war? The T-34 is not a failure, it's a casualty of timing, one of the most unforgiving forces in military history. The engineers did their job. The gun was extraordinary. The machine was capable. The war simply didn't wait. But the ideas survived. The 120mm gun concept proved so correct that it became the global standard. The lessons learned in the T-34 program fed into post-war American tank development, into the M103, into the early thinking that eventually produced the Abrams. Nothing built is ever truly wasted if the knowledge carries forward. The T-34 is a reminder that history doesn't reward the best. It rewards the timely. Perfection delivered one day late is just an exhibit in a museum. And yet, we're talking about it now. not the thousands of Shermans that actually fought, the handful of T-34s that never got the chance. So here's the question I want you to answer. If the war had lasted another year, if the T-34 had gone into production and met the Germans in the field, does it change the outcome? Or does it just change the casualty count? Tell me in the comments. I'll read the best ones in the next video. Like if you enjoyed this, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.